Good evening, bonsoir, and a good novembre. My name is Stephen Strober, and I am a member of the third generation of Holocaust survivors. We come together this evening on Zoom for our second virtual Kristallnacht commemoration organized by the Montreal Holocaust Museum. I would like to dedicate this evening's commemoration to the memory of my late dear friend and co-chair for a decade, Hanna Eliashiv.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Yasmine Abdel-Fadel et je suis membre du conseil d'administration du Musée de l'Holocauste de Montréal. Nous sommes réunis aujourd'hui, ce soir, pour nous souvenir, honorer et parler au nom de ceux qui ne peuvent plus témoigner pour eux-mêmes. En leur nom, nous devons continuer le combat contre la haine et l'oppression. Le passé continue de nous hanter et pour éviter que l'histoire se répète, nous continuerons d'honorer chaque année, par devoir de mémoire, toutes les victimes de cette tragédie.
We gather tonight to remember what many historians have agreed was the beginning of the Holocaust, Kristallnacht, the night of shattered glass, or as it is also referred to, the November pogroms. As was stated by the ambassador to Austria, Ronald S. Lauder, the Holocaust began with the sound of shattered glass and ended with the silence of the dead. Although Kristallnacht was by no means the beginning of the Nazis' atrocities and war against the Jews, it was a singular and uniquely devastating event that escalated and demonstrated a small precursor of what was to come. On November 7th, 1938, Hershel Greenspun, a 17-year-old Polish Jew, burst into the German embassy in Paris with the intention to kill the ambassador. He wanted to avenge the expulsion of his parents, who were among the 16,000 Polish Jews that had been expelled from Germany to Poland. Hershel shot and mortally wounded Ernst von Rath, the third secretary of the embassy. On the 9th and 10th of November 1938, state-sanctioned pogroms were unleashed against the Jews of Germany, Austria, and the recently incorporated territories. In 2 days, over 270 synagogues were burned, over 7,400 Jewish businesses were trashed and looted, 170 houses were destroyed, and Jewish community centers and cemeteries were desecrated. Some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and thrown into the Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen concentration camps. The death toll was at least 91 people.
Les actes de violence perpétrés contre les Juifs de tout le territoire du Troisième Reich furent présentés comme l'expression de la colère du peuple à la suite de l'assassinat du diplomate allemand à Paris. Mais dans les faits, Joseph Goebbels, le ministre allemand de la propagande et des membres du gouvernement nazi, ont planifié et ont organisé soigneusement ces pogroms. Comble du cynisme, les communautés juives d'Allemagne et d'Autriche ont été obligées de nettoyer, de payer et de réparer pour les dégâts occasionnés par les nazis.
Sadly and remarkably, it was also the unveiled transition of a society and people who chose to either accept, take part, encourage, or who stood by, watched, and were deafeningly silent. The past is never dead. To ensure that it is not repeated, it must be remembered. Tonight, we remember. We bring to you a special and interesting program this evening for our commemoration. In 1939, 3 professors of Harvard University organized a prize competition entitled My Life in Germany Before and After January 30th, 1933. Some 250 people sent in their memoirs, all of them refugees from Nazism, with almost 2/3 of the writers having found refuge in the United States. The memoirs reveal a great variety of Jewish experiences in Germany and Austria from the turn of the 20th century to the flight of their authors in 1939 and 1940.
Les personnes qui ont soumis leurs mémoires au concours représentent tous les âges et viennent de différents horizons. On trouve parmi eux des journalistes, écrivains ou médecins, aussi bien que des hommes et des femmes d'affaires, des employés de bureau, des ouvriers ou des femmes au foyer. Les mémoires reflètent bien les conditions de vie et les persécutions subies par les Juifs après la prise de pouvoir des nazis et montrent comment la société s'est transformée peu à peu sous la dictature.
For tonight's event, we have chosen 6 excerpts to show the first-hand experiences of Jews during the fateful days of the November pogroms and demonstrate the impact of the psychological and emotional trauma caused by these events. With our selection, we try to highlight experiences which we have not come across before in the testimonies of our survivors in earlier commemorations. The excerpts will be read by members of the Yiddish Theater of the Segal Centre and by the son of our late co-chair of the Kristallnacht Committee, Hanna Eliashiv, whom we lost last year. We believe that these performances will give us a much deeper understanding of the horrors that many lived through during Kristallnacht.
83 years have passed since that catastrophic night, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. We remember, and we remind, ourselves and others. And here we are, Montreal 2021, 83 years later, and the glass got broken again, this time of the building housing the Israeli consulate. In other words, housing Israel. Et oui, quelqu'un a même demandé au consulat israélien de payer les frais de réparation de leurs fenêtres. Un cas classique dans lequel on tient la victime responsable de ses souffrances. Mais les temps sont différents. Nous sommes en 2021. We're now 74th year of sovereignty, no longer an adolescent, entering maturity. Israel emerges as possibly the most exciting venture of the 21st century, and in partnership with Israel, world Jewry too. As said by one of our own, Bob Dylan, come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak so soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming, for the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing. We did not, of course, pay for the broken window, for the times have changed. No pressure, no diamond. It's 2021. This time we flourish. May the memory of those who perished during that catastrophic night, Kristallnacht, be forever a blessing. Que leur mémoire ne soit jamais oubliée. Thank you. Merci. Toda rabba.
The shooting of the legation secretary von Roth in the German embassy in Paris gave the German authorities the pretext they had been looking for to take extreme retaliatory measures against German Jews. When the news that a Polish Jew had murdered von Roth reached Germany, the government announced that the Jews would be subject to the harshest punishment, and that the nature of this punishment, which could never be harsh enough, would be made known in a few days. No one imagined in what form the already severely tried German Jews would be further tormented. People spent the first days of November in fear and apprehension. The heavy fine, 1 billion marks were supposed to be raised for the Reich, was already an excessive hardship, but people had resigned themselves to this punishment. Nonetheless, the events that took place simultaneously in all parts of Germany on 10th of November 1938 went beyond our worst expectations.
It was the harrowing night of November 10th, 1938, when in Germany, in accordance with a very precisely elaborated plan, the homes, shops of Jews were senselessly vandalized, plundered, destroyed, and put to the torch. On that night, synagogues and thousands of prayer halls and schools were set on fire at precisely the same time, and fire brigades and police all over Germany were not allowed to leave their quarters unless an express command to that effect had been given. In a single hour on that night, a horde of drunken animals in uniform wrecked the possessions, the past and the future of thousands of people, while bloodthirsty, savage, brutal creatures decked out and protected by the brown and black uniforms of the ruling party slaughtered poor, tormented people in the thousands and sadistically abused thousands of wretched people. On November 9th, 1938, around 11 o'clock in the evening, I came home from a Jewish aid organization meeting, and I can testify that most of the German people who a day later the government said were responsible for what happened that night lay peacefully in bed that evening. Everywhere lights had been put out, and nothing suggested that in the following hours such terrible events would take place. At 3 a.m. sharp, someone insistently rang at the door to my apartment. I went to the window and saw that the streetlights had been turned off. Nonetheless, I could make out a transport vehicle out of which emerged about 20 uniformed men. I recognized only one of them, a man who served as the leader. I called out to my wife, "Don't be afraid, they are party men, please keep calm." Then I went to the door in my pajamas and opened it. A wave of alcohol hit me and the mob forced its way into the house. The leader pushed by me and yanked the telephone off the wall. The leader of the SS man, green-faced with drunkenness, cocked his revolver as I watched, and then he held it to my forehead and slurred. "Do you know why we've come here, you swine?" I replied no, and he went on. "Because of the outrageous act committed in Paris, for which you are also to blame. If you even try to move, I'll shoot you like a pig." I kept quiet and stood, my hands behind my back, in the ice-cold draft coming in the open door. For another 20 minutes, the drunken SS leader fumbled threateningly with his revolver near my forehead. An inadvertent movement on my part, or a clumsy one on his, and my life would have been over. In the meantime, about 10 uniformed men had invaded my house. I heard my wife cry, "What do you want with my children? You'll touch the children over my dead body." Then I heard only the crashing of overturned furniture, the breaking of glass, and the trampling of heavy boots. Weeks later, I was still waking from restless sleep, still hearing that crashing, hammering, and striking. We will never forget that night. About half an hour, which seemed to be an eternity, the brutish drunks left our apartment shouting and bellowing. The leader blew a whistle, and as his subordinates stumbled past him, he fired his revolver close to my head, 2 shots into the ceiling. I thought my eardrums had burst, but I stood there like a wall. The last man who left the building hit me on the head so hard with the walking stick he used to destroy my pictures that a fortnight later the swelling was still perceptible. As he went out, he shouted at me, "There you are, you Jewish pig, have fun." My poor wife and the children, trembling with fear, sat weeping on the floor. We no longer had chairs or beds.
November 10th, morning, 5:45. The insistent ringing of the doorbell in the early morning hours quickly woke me up. I threw on an overcoat and, suspecting the worst, opened the door to the building. 3 men, 2 Gestapo agents and a police officer, came in and immediately declared that they had to undertake a search for weapons in the orphanage, as in all Jewish homes. The officials immediately went about their task, but searched only the ground floor rooms, in particular the small office and the children's study room. In the office, the telephone line was cut, boxes and books checked, and cash searched for. In a moment when he was not being observed, the Gestapo officer whispered in my ear, "All the Jewish men in the city were arrested last night. Don't worry, nothing will happen to you." After searching for about 20 minutes without finding anything at all, the Gestapo officers left, telling me, "No one must leave the building before 10 o'clock this morning. All the blinds on the street must remain closed. After 10, it will all be over." 9:30 a.m., loud ringing at the door to the building. I opened it, and a group of about 50 men, many with the collars of their overcoats or jackets turned up, immediately stormed into the house and went to the refectory, which was fortunately empty, in order to begin destroying things with an almost scientific thoroughness. The children's terrible cries of fear echoed through the building. I shouted in a very loud voice, "All children, go with me into the street!" The children immediately hurried down the small stairway, most of them without hats and coats, despite the damp, cold weather. I ran with them to the nearest crossroads where the town hall was located. There, I intended to put myself under police protection. The chief constable, Freihan, shouted back, "Jews will get no protection from us. Get out of here and take your children with you." At the same time, Freihan herded us towards a side street in the direction of the garden side of the orphanage. From that vantage point, we could now see how the police officers stood aside, while the men inside the building systematically destroyed the orphanage's inventory, shattering window panes, throwing books, chairs, beds, tables, linens, maps, valises, piano parts out of the windows and doors. Around 10:15, we heard a wail of sirens and saw an enormous cloud of smoke, whose location made it clear that the Nazis had set the synagogue on fire. Soon afterwards, we noticed other smoke clouds. As I later saw, Jewish buildings had been set on fire under the expert guidance of the fire brigade, or, if the buildings were not homes, completely reduced to ruins. We were herded into the schoolyard, which was near the synagogue, so that we could see clearly how Dinslaken's fire brigade encouraged the work of burning the synagogues by only keeping the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings.
November 10th, 1938. It is late at night. I want to try to write down with a trembling hand today's events that have engraved themselves in flaming letters on my heart. I want to write them down for my child so that someday he can read how they destroyed his life. I want to relate my experience at this midnight hour, sitting alone and trembling at my desk, groaning painfully like a wounded animal. I want to write in order not to scream out loud in the still of the night. This morning, my maid said to me, "It looks like they were at it again last night. In the first shop next door, the windows were smashed and everything was stolen." I only half listened to her. By that time, we were used to such things. Shortly afterwards, I was on my way to the clinic. It was odd that there was so much broken glass in the street. In the beautiful, elegant dress shop, all the windows were broken and the displays were empty. And it was in the same shop next door and at Etam, the fine stocking shop across the street. What have they done now, I wondered. Then I heard a well-dressed woman say to her husband as she walked past me, "Serves the damned Jews right. Revenge is sweet." Only then did I begin to understand what had happened and really looked around me. Broken glass everywhere. Demolished shops, insofar as there are still any Jewish shops in the Kaiserallee. Nauseated, I turned away and returned home. When I got home, my maid said, "Herr Doctor has already left. He was called out urgently for a heart attack." 9:30 p.m. The doorbell rang twice, briefly and urgently. I went to the door. "Who is there?" "Open up, police." Trembling, I opened the door. I knew what they wanted. "Where is the doctor?" "He's not in," I said. "What?" "The concierge saw him come home." "He was at home, but then he was called out again." They went up to the first door, locked. The second door, locked. "These are our examination rooms," I explained. They went to the next door. "Please don't rattle the handle," I said. "My child is asleep in there." "We know your Jewish tricks." He held his revolver under my nose and said, "One more word and the bullet's in your brain. Where have you hidden your husband?" My knees were shaking. "Just stay calm, I said to myself. "I'm not lying. My husband is not at home. But please shoot my child first and then me and aim well." And I opened the door that led to the room where my son was sleeping. But the two men were already getting ready to leave. Then I heard the door to our apartment opening. My husband had arrived. He arrived, poor man, at the very moment when I thought I had saved him. And they took him away, just like that. I ran after them into the street. "Where are you taking my husband? What has he done?" They shoved me away roughly. "You can ask about him tomorrow on the Alexanderplatz." And I saw them get into a car and drive away into the dark night.
November 10th, 1938. It was the most terrible day of the Nazi regime. We were supposed to pay the price for the murder of Vom Rath. There can be no doubt that everything took place in accordance with a plan, worked out long before, and that they were only waiting for a suitable opportunity. The so-called work began in the early hours. Arrests, abuse, plundering. From the balcony of my apartment, I saw individuals and whole groups of arrested men being taken to vehicles standing ready on the bridge. At about 5:30, I heard heavy steps in the corridor. They knocked, and I opened the door, and that was it. They let me take my personal documents with me, but emptied my wallet. The SA man stuck the money in his pocket, and then we were all taken away. We were led to the nearby Taborstrasse and put into a completely unfurnished, but particularly brightly lit apartment. We were led into an empty room and had to wait there for a long time. Then we were called one after the other into another room. When it was my turn, they made me take off my winter coat and wait. Soon a man came back with my coat. Both arms had been half cut away. I was taken into another room where my fellow sufferers were lined up.
they had all had their sliced-up coats put on inside out. The same was done to me. We were made to march down the street in rank and file and with our inside-out coats. I noticed that the other prisoners' trousers had been cut short and their coattails cut away. We were taken to the police station in the Große Mohrenstraße, where a large crowd shouted threats. After a time, we were all allowed to move outside. Outside stood an exceptionally high open lorry. We had to get in quickly, and the SA men who were there shoved and pushed us. We drove to the Prater police station. We were herded into the building like wild animals. SA men appeared and ordered us to do squats. Because it was impossible to move, everyone just bent their knees a little. Then the SA men repeatedly chose 2 prisoners and told them to box with each other. Since the prisoners did not want to hurt each other and therefore avoided hitting too hard, the men shouted, "That's not real boxing. We'll show you how it's done." And then they knocked the unfortunate victims' teeth out and left them with cuts on their faces. We were taken into the courtyard between 2 rows of SS men who were hitting people on all sides. All around I could see prisoners arranged in dense rows along the walls. We all stood in the courtyard for quite a long time. I heard the clock in the tower strike 12 and 1. From time to time we also heard moaning or shouting. The SA men were going from one group to another and mistreating the unfortunates. Finally, large vehicles of various kinds appeared, and the prisoners started to be taken away. We were unloaded in a large courtyard, and I realized that it was the courtyard of the Vienna Mounted Police Riding School. We stood in the courtyard for about 2 hours. Finally, my group was led into the arena. It was a very large, well-lit arena with a clay floor. Oh, the heat was unbearable, the thirst terrible. The arena was so full that we could only stand. There was nothing to sit on anyway, not even anything to lean against. Until 10 o'clock on Friday morning, there was no opportunity to quench our thirst. Only then did 2 young men appear, each carrying a bucket that was supposed to water horses. Each had a glass. That was supposed to slake the thirst of 5,000 people. Heart-rending scenes ensued. 5 to 10 people shared 1 glass of water. We were happy to get a single swallow. Not until Friday afternoon did the situation improve in this regard. More drinking glasses were brought in and more buckets of water passed around. People could slake their thirst. The first chance to get something to eat came only in the afternoon. Then a man came in with a basket of bread rolls, which was soon sold out. He returned again and again, but few people seemed to feel hungry, and I too was not thinking about food. In the meantime, people's fatigue had reached undreamt of levels. Just think of my own case. Since 6 on Thursday evening, I had not had the opportunity to rest for 1 moment, not to sit down or even lean against something. By Friday night, many people could no longer stand up and they collapsed. Soon, part of the arena was covered with people lying on the floor. The others had hardly enough place to stand. After a short time, the guard gave the order that no one was allowed to lie on the floor for more than half an hour, so that everyone could rest a little. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, it was my turn. For the first time in 35 hours, I had the right to lie down on the clay floor among many other bodies lying close to one another. But before I could even find a place, the time was up, and I was more tired than ever. Sunday, 13 November, was a very hard day for us. SS men repeatedly appeared and forced us to do very difficult exercises. At first it was bearable, but the horrors we had been through and our sleepless nights very quickly made us exhausted. The whole day went this way. Exercises and then more exercises. From time to time, SS men came in and mistreated and insulted the prisoners. The day went by with great suffering. We could hardly stand up anymore. We waited impatiently for night, which would finally give us some peace. About 2 a.m., we were woken by shrill commands. Men shouted, "Up, down, up, down." Although we were all sleepy and dead tired, we were on our feet in a moment and we jumped up and down rapidly. The 4 or 5 uniformed men who had come in insisted that we do everything precisely, that every time we were commanded to get down, we lay fully on the floor, and every time we were commanded to get up, we stood straight. After 2 hours of this, the men went away for a while. We heard the commands being shouted in the other rooms, but went back to sleep. I do not know how long it was before we were woken again by the deafening commands, up and down. Suddenly, the SS men noticed an Orthodox rabbi. In an instant, he was brought to the podium and made to sing Jewish songs. Just imagine the situation. Below, a crowd of tormented, terrified, and sleepy men, and before them, a singing rabbi surrounded by laughing SS thugs.
It was about 10:45 when our 4 police vehicles drove into Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The truck stopped suddenly with such a hard jolt that we literally banged into each other. The 2 policemen leapt out of the truck, and we heard a medley of raucous voices shouting, "Out, you Jewish swine! Get down from the truck! Are you not down yet?" We hurried to get out of the truck, but as we were jumping down, SS men armed with batons and whips attacked us. Amid wild shouts and curses, they beat us mercilessly. The SS men drove us along with blows from their batons and whips and repeated kicks. Powerful sweeping searchlights fell on us from the roofs of the buildings surrounding the area. They dazzled us so that we couldn't see clearly what was going on. At first, only 2 things were obvious. First, that the long column of prisoners were constantly being driven at a fast pace across a large open area. And second, that the SS men were striking us, incessantly shouting and cursing. As soon as we got near them, we had to expect to get kicks and blows on the head. Finally, the pursuit must have lasted about 30 minutes. I collided with the man in front of me. The column had stopped, and we stood still. Out of breath, gasping, coughing, trembling, hearts pounding, hundreds of hounded men stood there. Bringing us to the point of extreme exhaustion by chasing us across a large area was the first premeditated way of mistreating us. Now, the second method began: contrived, systematic bullying. We had to stand still on the same spot. At first, standing still felt good after a terrible half-hour-long run. Gradually, however, we began to feel cold. It was, after all, November. We still had our hats in our hands, but were not allowed to put them on. One of the older prisoners who had to supervise us had to bring along a sign that was attached to a stake. An SS man ordered each of us to hold up the sign for a while and then hand it to the next man. On the sign was painted in large letters, "We are responsible for the murder of Herr von Rath." The SS man saw to it that each of us held the sign high enough. After a time, a second sign was brought. It read, "We are the destroyers of German culture." It also had to be held by each man in our column, and then handed on to the next. About 50 yards away, I heard an SS man raging and shouting. He ordered us all to say in unison, "We are responsible for the murder of Herr von Rath." We had to bellow the two stupid sentences louder and louder, and the alternating chorus of several hundred men rang eerily through the cold winter night. Meanwhile, the SS men were continuing their senseless and arbitrary beatings. It was now about 1:30 a.m., and the night was getting colder and colder. Freezing and shivering, we still stood on the same spot. Then orders rang out. We had to run across the area, but now running felt like a relief after 2 hours of standing still. Near the two-story gate building, we were ordered to halt. We had to about face and now stood in front of a wall about 5 yards high that surrounded the whole of the camp square. Electrified barbed wire had been strung along the wall at about 20-inch intervals. Every 50 paces, a sign had been put up on the grass showing a white skull and crossbones against a black background. Every time the searchlight fell on the sign, the grinning skull eerily lit up. Then it disappeared again into the gloom. Other signs that had been put up at short intervals read, "You will be shot without warning." We were forced to keep looking at the high gray wall, the electrified barbed wire, and the skulls. The hours went by. We were still standing on the same spot with the skulls grinning at us. It grew quieter. The lights in the nearby barracks were put out, but the searchlights kept moving. And we stood and stood and stood. I tried to sleep a little standing up, but I couldn't do it. The cold became increasingly intense. The clock over the gate showed 4 a.m. I wondered whether the SS men or the camp commander had forgotten to give us the order to go into the barracks. My knees were trembling. I grew dizzy. At about 6 o'clock, we had to march across the muster ground to the wash barracks. It was such a relief to be able to walk these couple of hundred yards. We were completely stiff from standing there in the cold. We'd been on our feet for a full 24 hours. As we stood hour after hour, freezing, facing the electrified barbed wire fence, hoping in vain again and again to be led into one of the barracks, I had still believed that through some organizational error of some kind, someone had forgotten to grant us rest. Only later, when I saw that all the prisoners who had the misfortune to be sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp were subjected to such brutal exhaustion, did I recognize, with horror, that it was all part of a satanic and inhuman plan.
שוכן במרומים המצא מנוחה נכונה תחת כנפי השכינה במעלות קדושים קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים ומאירים להישמות איש השם ינוחו בשלווה ושלום, שלא ידעו בחייהם כזוהר הרקיע מאירים ומזהירים לנשמותיהם של רבבות אלפים אנשים ונשים, ילדים וילדות שנהרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו ונקברו חיים על קדושת השם. כולם קדושים וטהורים, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני ונחלתם. ינוחו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ויעלמה דברה חירותי, וימליך מלכותי. בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירן בעולמה ויאמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ויאמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ויאמרו אמן.
Engageons-nous à ne pas rester silencieux ou indifférents quand nous sommes témoins d'actes racistes, antisémites ou discriminatoires. Ayons le courage de nous battre pour les autres. Faisons la différence dans nos communautés, dans nos villes, nos provinces, dans notre pays, dans le monde. Ce soir, nous nous rappelons de ceux qui ont été assassinés durant l'Holocauste. Nous nous rappelons aussi de ceux qui furent victimes de la discrimination et de la haine. Exprimons notre volonté et notre détermination en tant que personnes libres de tout faire pour combattre l'oubli, le déni et les faussaires de l'histoire qui s'obstinent à réécrire le récit de cette tragédie pour mieux gommer la monstruosité des faits et duer la responsabilité des coupables.
Tonight, we remember those who experienced Kristallnacht, as well as all those millions who perished in the Shoah, and we honor the survivors. But we must also remember those who still suffer from hatred, prejudice, discrimination, and violence. We will share our hope and our commitment as a free people to never again permit such atrocities. Sadly, This commitment, though it has been stated many times, has not prevented more recent crimes against humanity. Let us pledge to honor and respect one another, and by doing so, we respect and honor those lives that were lost or altered on November 9th, 1938. Tonight, I would like to pay homage to the late Hanna Eliashiv, the always dynamic and dedicated co-chair of the Kristallnacht Committee right up to her passing. Hanna was an amazing person, a tour de force, a source of strength, wisdom, dedication, and passion. She shared her ideas, knowledge, and energy with many different organizations and institutions of the Jewish community of our city, and worked tirelessly to enrich Jewish life and Judaism in Montreal. Hanna accomplished and exceeded whatever she set out to do, and left an indelible print of her enthusiasm, commitment, and righteous character on all those who crossed her path. From her countless students to all the people in the organizations in which she was involved, and to the community at large, she is terribly missed and will never be forgotten. Hanna made our lives richer and more meaningful. She is a true Eshes Chayal. May her memory be a blessing to her family and to all who knew her. We would like to thank Joey Elias and the members of the Yiddish Theater for giving of their time to do the readings, as well as to the Segal Centre for inviting us into their space. Thanks go to Esther Ander, Commemoration and Oral History Coordinator, for organizing this year's commemoration. Without you, Esther, and your guidance and direction, none of this is possible. We would also like to thank Sarah Fogg, Head of Communications, for her invaluable help. Last but not least, the museum's Executive Director, Mr. Daniel Amar, for his leadership. Thank you for attending our commemoration, and we wish you all a good evening.